Welcome to this panel, which has been denominated is the WTO's 10th birthday worth celebrating. Well, as we all know, WTO was born 10 years ago with great expectations. It's timely to look back to WTO's short history, and perhaps more importantly, to try to look ahead, try to see not only the past, but more importantly, the future of the institution. And that is why we are here. I would like to say from the very beginning, and perhaps just to provoke our challenger, what I believe about the performance of the WTO. I believe that the WTO has been extremely successful. So successful in the sense that it has delivered not less and probably much more than what could have been expected from the mandate and the instruments that the organization has received from its members. That's my strong belief. The question is whether that is enough. And I would say, no, it's not enough, because there is much to do about trade liberalization, services liberalization. There are numberless estimates of what could happen if we had freer trade in goods and services, and all the estimates I know simply mean that there will be more income, there will be more employment in the world, more opportunities. This is not to say that there's always adjustment costs that have to be paid. The other reason is that why WTO has to change, and it's changing, is because the governance issues that we had 10 or 15 years ago are very different today. International trade is different. Trade policies are different in some senses. We have new phenomena, like the talk of the town now is things like outsourcing. So there are many things that demand a revision of the institution. And in fact, the institution has been trying for a number of years to undertake those reforms. We had the Seattle attempt to launch a new round, and then we have the launching of the Doha round with enormous expectations. When we got together here last year, I think we were speaking about a tale of 3 Fs. The F of frustration, the F of fiasco, and the F of frivolity of those that were supposed to lead by example. Well, fortunately, last year was not so bad after all. There was a purpose of establishing some framework for negotiations on agricultural and non-agricultural goods. And at the 11th hour of the deadline, a deal was clinched to produce that framework, and that avoided what could have been practically a total collapse. And now we'll see when the negotiations will be renewed, and perhaps we can speak about that a little bit. But anyways, we go back to our questions. Our question is, how has WTO been doing, and how it should be doing in the future, and what must be done in order to have a WTO that accomplishes fully its mission. And to try to answer and debate those questions, we have a very distinguished panel, and I will go by alphabetic order. We have Professor Jagdish Bhagwati of Columbia University, who doesn't need any introduction because he's one of the best-known names in this field. We have the honor of having with us Mr. Joseph Deiss, former president of the Swiss Confederation and now federal councillor of the economy. We have the pleasure of having with us our friend, Minister Luiz Fernando Furlan, Minister of Development, Industry and Trade of Brazil. We have with us Dr. Supachai, Director General of the WTO. And we have with us somebody that, who I like to call the founding father of the WTO. I think one day the history of the final stages to conclude the Uruguay round will have to be written in enormous detail, in great detail, and you will see that I'm not overstating Pete's condition. And of course, we have Neil, how do you say in Ireland, Kearney? Or Kearney, if you come from another part of the world. And Neil will be the challenger. He's such a great, nice person. I don't know why he was assigned to be the challenger. But anyways, he will be, and he has promised to play that role. Neil is General Secretary of the International Textile, Garment and Leather Workers Federation, based in Brussels, and I am Ernesto Cedillo. So what we will do, I will ask the panelists and the challenger to make some introductory remarks. I will beg our panelists to be particularly brief, although I must say that in the case of Peter, since he was the chairman of a group of wise men, or consultative board, formally denominated, and they just produced a report, perhaps he can have 1 or 2 more minutes than the others, and of course Dr. Supachai, who is now in charge of the shop, perhaps could give us a little bit more on this question. So I go immediately to ask Professor Bhagwati. I will go by alphabetic order about the panelists, then I will call upon Neil to challenge them.
Do we have to turn something on? It's on anyway. It's on. Okay. Well, thank you, Ernesto, for this excellent introduction. In the few minutes that I have, let me first join you in saying that the WTO has been enormously successful. It's overseen substantial reduction of trade barriers during its 10-year period, and it has replaced a rather amorphous, chaotic, I mean, not chaotic is probably too strong a word, but an amorphous, very successful GATT, which did not have any binding disciplines and so on, to the point where it was known as a general agreement to talk and talk, which was a witticism but not totally justified by the facts, but into a more sort of effective institution, because the GATT was not really an institution, it was a de facto institution. So I think I would join you in saying that WTO has been successful. But I think we shouldn't underestimate also the scope of unilateral trade liberalization. I have a book called Going Alone, which sounds a lot better than unilateral trade liberalization. It's like unilateral disarmament. But essentially, large numbers of countries, not because of the World Bank or IMF conditionality, simply came to appreciate on their own that the very high trade barriers that they had were not particularly useful, and they've brought down their trade barriers on their own. But in the end, reciprocity plays a major role. If I can get you to reduce your trade barriers, as while I'm reducing my own, you get a twofold advantage from your own reduction and from the other guy's reduction. Politically, it's of course the only way to proceed for many countries, and the WTO and the GATT before that has represented the way in which we do this. Essentially, it looks mercantilist, like, liberalization is not a concession. It's actually a benefit to yourself, but it has its uses, and it has worked very well. The one problem, I think I'll just focus on a couple of problems which we pick up in the report, or developments which are not exactly sanguine. One is simply the proliferation of the what are known as regional trade agreements, but I prefer to call them bilaterals or preferential trade agreements. The original GATT had exception for that. I mean, the GATT actually embodies as its principal value most favored nation clause. I mean, it's like if you go to the ILO, if there's a meeting with ILO, the right to unionize would be the key principle. And the key principle of the international trading system embodied in the GATT is non-discrimination and MFN treatment. The lowest tariff I give to one person must be extended to every member. So there were only well-defined exceptions, but that was the central principle. That's been virtually eroded now because particularly under Article 24 and the enabling clause, large numbers of bilaterals have grown up to the point where it's become a systemic problem. For individual countries, of course, it can be desirable to enter into these things. Yeah, but the total, you have the problem that we have about 300 and they're multiplying by the week. So the erosion of MFN is a problem. The other, of course, is how do we bring in the trade liberalization, which is, which ZDO said was very important, and that is on services and on agriculture and so on. And I think that still remains a negotiating problem. We don't go into that, but I think that's really the next task, which is really important before us, how to make progress on services. And agriculture remains the big issue. I wish President Chirac, who had yesterday said he was going to actually support agricultural trade liberalization rather than support the eradication of AIDS, on which there's a universal agreement. It would have been much nicer to have had trade rather than aid. But of course, I mean, I'm sure people will convey that to him. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jagdish. President Deiss.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would say first that for me, WTO is today really the worldwide center of discussion, of exchange about economy, and has a function which can be compared to United Nations on the political level. And I would say that activity is very intense. The experience I made, having been foreign minister too, that in WTO negotiations, ministers are at the table of negotiations from the beginning to the end, because it's really important issues we are discussing. Now, we have, of course, very positive results, and I would also agree that WTO has been very successful. But Cancun also has been a deception, and has shown for me at least four elements. First, WTO with nearly 150 members is not only industrialized countries, it's also developing countries, it's emerging economies, it's very complex. And we have difficulties in sharing this diversity. Second, trade discrimination, it's not only tariffs. It's much more today. It's not only quotas and so on. It's a lot of different systems of means of non-tariff barriers you can build up. And we have to work on this. Third, economy, international economy today is not only trade. It's services, it's investment, and it's many more. That means we have to be also very careful in protecting investments, in protecting intellectual property and topics like that. And finally, I would say that WTO, it's not only the big ones. And Cancun has shown movement in the geography of WTO. The emerging groups, the G20 and others, have shown that also the power is newly distributed and makes that the game or the challenge has changed. And I think that if you are looking to the future, it's in these four fields at least. There may be others. Professor Bhagwati has talked about the free trade agreements and things like that. But I think that this development is the explication of the difficulties we have to make progress on the internal challenge of WTO. Thank you.
Minister Furlan.
Well, I had the opportunity to watch the endless discussions of the Uruguay round, and that was a nice experience for a young guy at that time. And so I believe that the Doha round is going quite well if you compare with the Uruguay round. I believe also that the creation of WTO for for us, like developing countries, was one of the most important tools that we have today in order to fight against the obstacles that we face for market access. And I also believe that Cancun was a very good lesson, because you know that in the past the GATT discussions were mostly polarized by the big guys, and Cancun revealed that it is possible to have a group of developing countries that leveling the playing field of the discussions and putting the voice, the silent voice of the majority of the countries that are members of the WTO. The biggest challenges that I see for the coming years, the major challenge is to deliver. To deliver, because the patience is of the countries and the negotiators after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, the expectations are very high. Joseph Deiss was mentioning about the non-tariff barriers, and I was recalling that last month we signed an agreement with one of the major countries in the world to export fruits. And then at the end, with all the sanitary issues solved, all the issues solved, they said, your packing houses need to have round windows instead of square windows. We are trying to fix the windows, but why? So these are the kind of non-tariff barriers that creates obstacles that are not meaningful. And I believe that the other challenges is to fulfill what was written at the beginning of the Doha development round. So not leaving the path that was the major really reason of the development round. That is to include a large part of the world and also to reduce the obstacles to agriculture. I believe that WTO is equipped, and the recent developments regarding to the panels of cotton, of sugar, and others are saying that yes, there is technology, there is good people, and there is decisions that can help mainly for the developing world to fulfill the 3 pillars, which is elimination of export subsidies by 2010. It's our aim. Market access and to deal with internal support. I have always been joking with Joseph Deiss that I cannot understand why Switzerland needs to produce sugar. Even in the calendars of Switzerland, you don't see sugar. You see nice landscapes, some cows, but no sugar. Why? Paying to the producer 3 times the world market price. That is, you know, some countries in the Caribbean are becoming more poor because somebody is producing sugar with a lot of subsidies. I believe that we are prepared to deal. We are committed to have a constructive way to deliver the Doha round, but it is really time to spread the progress, opening the markets in order to reduce poverty. We are talking a lot about poverty, and all of us, we know that market access will reduce poverty around the world and will be fostering the development. By the way, last year, Brazilian imports have grown 30%. And this year, up to yesterday, keep growing 30% over the same period, January last year. Our exports, in the opposite side, have grown also 30%. So Brazil is opening more and more the doors of its market because we want to be part of the world community. But we need reciprocity. And maybe the key word for this round is reciprocity. Thank you.
Dr. Supachai.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. First of all, I would like to thank you, Ernesto, for having made a very positive and well-balanced remarks about what we have done. It's not only the positive things, but also we have to weigh that with some of the things that we have actually failed to deliver. I think it's a very balanced one. I have also to thank the World Economic Forum for allowing you and all of us to be here this afternoon so that we can celebrate this, to us, important event at the 10th anniversary of the World Trade Organization by having this kind of a dialogue of a meeting. Not that I would like to hear any laudable terms or positive comments alone from you, but we would like to hear what kind of criticism, what kind of reasons you have for not agreeing with some of the things that we've been doing. What more can we do to make the trade scene one which is more acceptable to every participating member country and one which can be made use of so that we can perpetuate the kind of sustainable development process around the world. Now, if you look at our system, I would have to warn you from the beginning that you read the papers, you expect news about how slow we are, how ineffective we are, inefficient we are, we're not making deals, we are late in our deal making and things like that. I want you to not to be surprised by this, that trade negotiations are indeed tortuous, very demanding, time-consuming, lengthy, and fraught with all kinds of pitfalls and difficulties. So don't expect that we'll be having smooth sailing for this round or whatever kind of negotiation we have. They're going to be difficult. We have been pushed to the brink many times in our past. But thanks to the mature membership, they understand. There are politicians who understand. There are people who are my predecessors, like Peter here, Renato, who is not here, Mike, who is not here, but I have good successors who have made life easy for me and convinced people to stay involved with the institution, with the organization. And we're not afraid to be doing self-criticism. You've been hearing of this Sutherland report. This is a report of the consultative board that I have commissioned to work on the future perspectives of this organization, and Peter will be telling you more about it. I have good friends like Peter and Jagdish who are willing to sacrifice their very expensive time to be working for free, pro bono on this board for a year, earning nothing, except sometimes some criticism that they're not consulting us, why don't they ask our opinion, why don't they put in things that we would like to see. They do this, and for the sake of helping us to strengthen the whole mechanism of our international trade. So we have our ups and downs. We seem to be failing in certain events, but the measure of how mature we are, how resilient we are, is the times that we have always come back. We've always come back from the brink. We have come back with, I would say, with more efficiency. After Seattle, it took us maybe longer than a year to come back. After Cancun, it took us less than 6 months to put things back on trail. And so we are now still working on. And the thing that we don't do in this organization, whatever kind of failures we have, disappointment we have, we don't point fingers. We don't try to say, you've not done this, you've not done that, why don't you go and do this? This is something which is very childish. And in the past 2.5 years that I've been working here, we've been trying to help to solve all these issues by trying to address the shortcomings and not by pointing fingers. I think we have succeeded quite adequately in terms of expanding the globality of this organization. We've had 21 more members after 1995, including the major player like China becoming member, but also don't forget the small players like Nepal and Cambodia. So we have people joining us from the largest part of the economies and also the LDCs like Nepal and Cambodia. We've been successful. At the moment, I think we are on the verge of one of the most unprecedented commitment and achievements in the history of this organization, I would say, in getting rid of all forms of trade distortions, domestic or export subsidies. Particularly export subsidies is something which is so ruinous to the prices for the poor farmers around the world. So this is an achievement. You know that we have rules, and some people do not agree with our rules. But I will assure you that these rules have been put to good use. And one example, because I don't want to exceed the time, one good rule, which is a rule on intellectual property right. TRIPS has been criticized times and again. But we have been able to make use of the TRIPS so that there could be exemptions so that poor countries can get their hands on affordable medicine. It's not being fully used at the moment, but it's there to be used so that when poor countries which would like to source their HIV/AIDS medicine from the cheapest source, they are now allowed to do so. We have been successful in providing for spatial treatment of the poor countries, and not in the least developed countries, the LDCs. They have a special place in our organization. They have concession. European Union give them the tariff-free and quota-free market access. Japan does do it to them. US has AGOA treating some of the countries on a spatial basis, and we are working to more or less introduce this on an institutional basis into our agreement. We are paying attention in the round. Not that we are pushing only blindly with further liberalization. We're doing this keeping in our mind that there are countries that might be affected negatively because of the push for liberalization. There are net food importing countries. There are also countries that have been living off from the spatial concession that they have. These are so-called preference-dependent countries. So in this round of our negotiation, member countries are mindful that in order to help this country tide over the difficult phase of adjustment, we are going to place in some help, some assistance so that they can be afforded a certain form of adjustment assistance. We've been working well with other international...
You are taking time from your predecessor. So
okay, just one more minute. Just one more minute. I think we've been working well with other international institutions like the World Bank, the Fund, UNCTAD, UNDP, and all these organizations. This is a plus. And lastly, I think the dispute settlement system, which keeps peace in the whole trading arena, has been highly reliable, so well functioning that at the moment, everyone, including the developing countries, are making use of the system. So I rested that, Ernesto. Thank you for the time you gave me.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind introductory remarks. Let me make a couple of simple points. The WTO is the greatest advance, its creation in multilateral governance since the great period of institution building after the Second World War. It's provided a rule-based system which is crucial for the interests of the weak. Otherwise, we have the law of the jungle. It has been a significant success, most particularly because it has set up an adjudication system which allows for the adjudication of disputes, which has been widely recognized as being free, fair, and impartial. And that allows us to try to manage the very difficult process of bringing together, with a sense of order and purpose, the different demands of 150 almost countries that are members. There were 23 in 1948 when it was founded. If globalization is to function effectively and without division and possibly war, it is vital that we have a rule-based system. And that rule-based system is the achievement of what the WTO is. Its greatest achievement since it came into existence has been the accession of China. That and its organization and structuring of that integration of a former command economy into a global economic space is an enormous achievement. There are very few people left today, except for some lobbies, that believe in the protectionist case. It costs the consumer money, it deprives equality of opportunity to the poor and the weak, and it damages the equity of the global system. So we have a fragile and very important institution, which is the WTO. I say fragile because it's only existed since the 1st of January 1995. It's fragile because there are all sorts of potential and real disputes. You can read of them in your paper every day between developed countries and between developing and developed countries and between developing countries. And all of these disputes, absent common sense, have the capacity to undermine the authority of something that is vitally important for us all, which is a rule-based system. I lived and come from a very small country, and the second Irishman, incredibly, on this panel, which has benefited from its integration in the European Union, providing it with market access. In the global sense, in a way, the WTO, although it's intergovernmental, is an expansion of that. It's an expansion of a rule-based system that the weak can rely upon in their negotiations with those that have more. So it's vital. Second point is, reference has been made to the advisory board, consultative board, which Jagdish and I served, amongst others. Niall, I see you here as well, another member. That board produced a report which looked at the future of the WTO. And in that report, we tried to set out minimal requirements for the development of the organization to ensure that it survives the difficulty of the current and other negotiations. It means giving some power and authority, for an example, to the directorate, to the WTO itself. 600 staff, much smaller than the World Wildlife Fund, and yet declared to be one of the most important institutions in the world by our chairman, authoritatively and correctly. This is a tiny organization, under-resourced, which has become the focal point of utterly nihilistic attacks in the context of places like Seattle and Cancun, and ridiculously under attack from NGOs who profess to be protecting the interests of the weak. The weak want the WTO. And the challenges, I suspect, for the future of the WTO may well come from the more powerful, the protectionism of the developed world. So it seems to me to be utterly crazy to have NGOs arguing for the destruction of the very institution that provides some rule-based system for the global economy and avoids the law of the jungle, which, as I said, always historically has worked to the disadvantage of the poor. I'm not going to go into the report. I'm just going to make a couple of broad points that we made in it. First of all, Jagdish very properly made reference to the proliferation of agreements between members on a bilateral or plurilateral basis, which are not global. Now, the danger about this is simply that you create what Jagdish has called a spaghetti bowl of agreements with differing terms of access between countries into different markets. And it ultimately creates a situation where you actually create an argument against trade liberalization for those who are already in preferential agreements. So some developing countries with specific preferential agreements and access say, well, we'd better stop all further liberalization because somebody else may get the benefits that we already have. Some of these may be colonial benefits, some of them may be benefits of other kinds. And this is very dangerous. The idea of the most favored nation, which the whole concept was based upon, which was, when the GATT was created, that everybody would have equal rights of access, and if you gave access to one on specific terms, then everybody would have the same thing. The EU, for an example, today only gives that MFN right to 9 countries out of 150. And they're the predictable ones: US, Japan, Australia, and so on. Everybody else is in a special deal. Now, it's not an EU problem. The US is at it. Everybody's at it. It's very dangerous. One point. Second point that I would make is that it is vitally important that we should have a situation in the context of the WTO, that the WTO Secretary General, Director General, should have real power and authority. It's an intergovernmental organization. Agreements can only be reached by member states. It's not supranational. We know all of that. But there has to be a recognition that the Secretariat is more than a Secretariat. It has some obligation as guardian of the system and has to be given the authority to make statements on behalf of the institution and its basic principles. We have to have a situation, too, where the dispute settlement body, which is the court that I talked about, has the real authority and the resources necessary to give the decisions which will bind the member states, namely the world, in their trade policies. And something more, I think, has to be done about that. Finally, we have gone into in some detail the disconnect that sometimes seems to exist between what's happening in Geneva and what's happening in capitals, what ministers know about in detail, and the detailed negotiations that are taking place in Geneva. And that's very dangerous. We used to have a thing called a green room, where a smaller group of countries selected on a basis which was not transparent used to, in effect, make the agreements. The EU and some of the bigger countries, Brazil would be there and India perhaps, but others mightn't be there, and there was no representation. We're very worried about that. In fact, if I may say so in conclusion, the one conclusion that I had when I was Director General, and I'm sure I'll be shot by a number of ministers for saying this, is that we should never have a ministerial meeting until the only thing that they have to do is to celebrate and write on the bottom line. Because if you have a complicated negotiation with 150 ministers turning up in Brussels, Seattle, Cancun, or anywhere else, and they have to do something more than look at one issue, you can be assured that you'll never have an agreement. So we have to have another system, ministerial meetings perhaps every year, but finalizing negotiations has to be done in a better way. Otherwise, the Doha development round, notwithstanding the heroic efforts of people like the Director General and the support of intelligent advocates like our chairman, will not come to a conclusion. It will be talk and talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Neil, I think you have a few ideas to challenge, if you wish.
Thank you, Chairman. It looks like 6-1. You described me as reasonable, so I have to be reasonable. Before celebrating, we have to look at achievements, but we also have to look at failures. Achievements, if the WTO didn't exist, I suppose it would have to be invented, probably in a different form. The WTO has, in its 10 years, achieved recognition as the institution dealing with trade facilitation, even if it is not always admired. Then I hesitate, and I struggle to find other achievements. So let me look at what I see as some of the failures. The Doha development round, I think, has yet to produce any meaningful results. We've seen very little growth in poor economies. The promised income gains at the outset of the WTO in industrialized countries are unrealized. I think 1/3 of what was forecast. The economic benefits to developing countries not delivered. The number and the percentage of people in LDCs in extreme poverty has risen in every year, every single year since 1995. 550 million people are now living on less than $1 a day. Extreme poverty. And the crazy thing is that millions of those are working people, working in export industries. Take Bangladesh. At the beginning of 1995, the minimum wage in the garment industry in Bangladesh was $33 a month. Today, it is $16. Half what is described as extreme poverty. We have today 185 million unemployed, the highest numbers ever recorded. Yes, there have been gains in poverty reduction, primarily in China and India. And interestingly, both of those countries are countries which have greatly diverged from WTO recommended policies in the past. Trade has expanded, yes, but not uniformly. Industrialized countries and a group of 12 developing countries have accounted for the lion's share of that expansion. Most developing countries have seen no significant trade expansion. Most LDCs have actually experienced a decline in their share of world markets. And that's in spite of adopting trade liberalization measures. And often trade growth is not sustainable. Take the textile and clothing sector. The end of the multi-fiber arrangement and the advent of trade liberalization in the sector is threatening 1 million jobs in Bangladesh, 1 million jobs in Indonesia, 300,000 of the 350,000 jobs in Sri Lanka. And it is estimated that from the 130 country producers today, there will in a few years' time only be 20 producing textiles and clothing for export. Those eliminated will be the poorest countries. Countries where there is no alternative employment, because they built their export-based economies on the back of low wages. And there's been no reinvestment, even in the industries that we're exporting. What's the cause of all this? I believe it is the failure of the WTO to address the social dimension of trade. So we have seen a massive increase in export processing zones, where the workers employed have no rights, where wages are extremely low, where working conditions are exceedingly poor. The WTO has introduced rules to protect commercial, financial, and intellectual property interests. Alongside that, they have introduced mechanisms for enforcement. Only the social dimension has been left out. And when real problems arise, the WTO won't examine these with a view to remedies. Take, for example, textiles and clothing. Many countries have asked for an examination of trade liberalization, its impact on emerging and struggling industries, with a view to policies being introduced to help them to adjust to meet free market conditions. That has been denied. What about the question of fairness? I believe fairness doesn't exist at the WTO. It continues to be dominated by a handful of powerful interests. And as someone said recently, a conversation between a mouse and a cat is not a conversation. After 10 years, the global economic situation is more unstable. The global social situation is unsustainable. There is a race to the bottom in social conditions to meet global competition. In textiles and clothing, Bangladesh has legalized extra working hours. The Philippines has said minimum wage legislation won't apply to the garment sector. And there are demands in Cambodia to remove the premium for overtime working in the garment sector. And what we are seeing today, the migration of millions of textiles and clothing jobs to China. And of course, when these criticisms are raised, the WTO does not shoulder the blame. It blames others. So, Chairman, because of these and other failures, I believe that the WTO cannot publicly convince that globalization can be beneficial if its potential is harnessed and the downside is eliminated. Well, I know this is not exactly the news that anyone wants to receive on their birthday. So I must apologize for spoiling the party. Thank you.
No, thank you, thank you. I think that if we are going to evolve from a dialogue of the deaf to a real dialogue, we have to put the facts on the table. And I think the facts are very simple. Those countries that are lifting their people out of poverty are those countries that over the last 20 years have engaged in more, not less trade. Those countries that are more, not less globalized. And precisely those countries that have, for many reasons, structural inside those countries, and also failures of the general system, those countries where we find 2 billion people poor are those countries that are participating only with 2% of global trade. I think that, for example, speaking about Bangladesh, It will be interesting to go there and ask those people, would you be better off if these textile jobs had not come to your country 5 or 10 years ago? And I think the overwhelming response would be, of course I will be worse off. And I want these jobs, and of course I want to keep those jobs. And you are right to the extent that rich countries, by backloading the phasing out of the multi-fiber agreement, do have a great responsibility on this that unfortunately could be a serious problem. But is that a failure of the WTO, or is that a failure of the members, and particularly the most influential members of the WTO? But anyways, let's try to look ahead. Are we going to have a Doha round? Are the agreements reached last July enough to really put on track the Doha round? I think right now is the question, the big question, because precisely in the Doha round, we have to fix some of the issues, real issues, and I am in agreement with a few of them that Neil has raised. Dr. Supachai, we heard when this agreement was clinched that rich countries said, yes, we will eliminate export subsidies, but they didn't say when. Yes, we will eliminate substantially domestic support, but didn't say what was substantial, neither when they will do it. They said that they were going to reduce significantly tariffs, but they didn't say when and by how much. They redefine in this agreement the blue box to accommodate US agricultural policy to some extent, some of their sins. And even somebody like Pascal Lamy was very happy to say that he was very pleased with the agreement because this agreement locked into the WTO the common agricultural policy. With those bases, are we going to have a Doha round concluded successfully?
Ernesto, you're talking about the so-called July decision, which is only a halfway house to the final agreement. We have always been saying that the July package was not meant to be the end of the round. It was meant to help to salvage the round because the round was a little bit, let me give the right word, moribund. It was, we're coming to the brink. The July package brought the round back on track with a commitment that we have never seen before on domestic support and on the phasing out of export subsidies. It's only a commitment, you're right. But because it is a commitment and not the final agreement yet, that's why we're working these days on the concretization of how much are we going to deal with the high end of the tariffs. What we have agreed is to apply an ambitious level of tariff reduction for the high end of the tariffs, which is also quite a significant commitment. The phasing out of the export subsidies, we are negotiating on that basis. Before this round, there was no commitment to do anything to this phasing out of the export subsidies at all. So this is a real commitment. I think what we are going to do this year, and particularly in Hong Kong, is to call the bluff, to put the money where the mouth is, to see how the countries, and I would not single out any countries, whether they would deliver on this commitment. I think this is one area in which together, and that's why I welcome, and Neil, you don't have to feel bad about saying bad things about us on our birthday. It's okay, because I think we are courageous enough to be willing to listen to remarks like you. But let me say one thing. I won't respond to all the things that Neil has said. But let me say one thing, that people should not be ascribing the role of a kill-all, sort of Deus ex machina role, to the trade issue. A trade agreement will not help to solve all the issues of the LDC's issues of poverty. It's only one of the means to do so. But it's a powerful mean. But it's always been kept sometime in a place where it cannot be fully exploited. So what we're trying to do is to fully exploit the trade means so that we can give the opportunities for market. We can give opportunities for countries to exploit their own comparative advantages so that they can compete in the world market. But we need domestic economic rationale. We need good set of macroeconomic rationale decisions, implementations of the macroeconomic policies, so that we can have the foundations for the application of the trade rules.
Minister Furlan, Celso Amorín, Minister Amorín, called the July Agreement a combination of trade liberalization and social justice. Can we really feel about that agreement? And I will insist on the question, is that really a base to go on? Doesn't Brazil hasn't it been Brazil the champion of liberalization in agriculture? Is Brazil happy with what has happened so far during the round?
I'm not sure if we can be face all the challenges that you mentioned, but being a participant in early July last year in the weekend meeting of the so-called NG5 in Paris, I understand that that day it appeared to be possible to unblock the Doha round. When in one moment there was an exchange of points of view where the representative of the European Union agreed to move on regarding to export subsidies if the North American representative accepted to phase out with the export subsidies related to credit. I believe that was the key issue that helped a few weeks later to move the whole process. So I believe that the strengthness of the G20 was already proven in some battles. And for those who in Cancun could imagine that the group was like fireworks, that you see a beautiful scene and then 15 minutes after it's blackout. It was not. The G20 survived. We had some defeats. We had also a lot of pressure. We had people joining, countries joining the group. And we are totally pro-Doha round. We don't want to block anything. We just want to deliver what was written at the beginning in Doha. And Brazil is one of the countries, together with India, with South Africa, with the other countries, helping to move ahead, to get a conclusion that could go forward regarding what Peter said. Because everybody, including last year, we had here at the forum discussions, where it was recognized by top officials from several countries, including leading countries of Europe, that if we don't move on agriculture, we'll have more and more a divided world between the rich countries and the poor countries. And I'm sure that there will be no higher, tall walls around rich country that will separate in the future rich and poor. The only way is to balance and to let the developing countries grow. And the first step is to liberalize agriculture. So it's so clear that you see from Germany, from UK, from a lot of countries, and it's crazy when you imagine that a few countries, maybe 4 or 5, can keep doing the wrong moves in order to create obstacles for the Doha round.
Peter, good fathers defend their children. Do you have something to say about?
I certainly do, to Neil. I think it peculiarly odd to listen to a lecture on morality of open trade from the textile industry, which has been, with the agricultural sector, the two great areas of European and American protectionism over decades. And it's easy to set up a straw man to knock it down in the global trade system by saying that there are parts of the world that are grossly and immorally impoverished, which of course is true. But as the Director General pointed out, that is not the problem, or is not caused by the World Trade Organization. It's often caused by an inability to take advantage of trading opportunities, often because of the continuing protectionism in areas like textiles and agriculture. So I just don't accept the line at all of a lecture on the iniquities of open trade from the textile sector. The multi-fiber agreement has been roundly condemned by just about every economist that in the world over a couple of decades. And I think that whilst I can quite understand and indeed admire the articulate ability of somebody defending it, I don't think it's fair. And I don't think it's fair in particular to put it up without coming up with a solution. And as to the arguments about introducing into the WTO extraneous issues to pure trade issues, the reality is that that is rejected by every developing country, bar none. The people who Neil professes to be concerned to protect, because they fear that that mechanism will be used by lobbies, whether it be agriculture or textiles or whatever, in the developed world to distort access to markets in the developed world. And that's the fear, and that's the reality. The other point I would make, just to make myself unpopular in every conceivable quarter, is that the Doha development round cannot itself succeed if it is simply an obligation to deal more fairly with the developing world, which is absolutely fundamental to it and should be the basis on which it takes place. But there's also an obligation on the developing countries to step up to the mark in terms of creating a degree of reciprocity in movement, without which you'll never get a trade agreement. You will never get an agreement unless there's some movement. And one of the great failures in trade negotiation history, I think, has been that in some cases the developed economies have just simply allowed, in certain cases, developing countries to maintain utterly protectionist regimes, as a result of which their economies have not moved. Whereas those who have moved more rapidly have provided growth for their own people. So I would merely make the plea that the G20 in particular, which I think it is willing to do, moves forward, as I believe Brazil would wish to do, and I hope others as well, in putting forward substantial programs for trade liberalization on the developing countryside as well. Otherwise, we'll never get the equilibrium needed to bring around to a conclusion.
We are running out of time, and we really want your questions, and I am sure that Neil will have a chance to respond to Pete by answering some of your questions. So I would like to open the floor to questions, otherwise we will have no time to do it. Felipe? Yeah, over here, please.
Thank you very much. Felipe Larraín, Catholic University of Chile. First of all, let me say that I would like to bring a small present and a cake for this anniversary, because I think there's a lot accomplished at the WTO. But saying that, I would like to say a word on behalf of regional and bilateral agreements. I think the two views that have been said here are, pretty much unfavorable to these agreements. The first thing on these agreements is that in a way they are the response to the slow movement of the WTO. So I mean, it's an endogenous thing that you get agreements because there's not fast moving enough. The other thing is that you have one risk, which you mentioned, Mr. Sutherland, in terms of the countries not willing to concede at the aggregate level because they want to maintain their benefits. But on the other hand, the fact that the world is moving in a lot of these regional agreements may mean that it's putting some pressure on WTO as well to move faster. So that's a second thing. And the third, just to mention the concrete case of Chile. Chile has agreements with the European Union, with the WTO, with the United States, with Korea, and is starting agreements with China and Japan. So, and has with most of Latin America. So Chile has right now agreements with about 70% of its trade. I think Chile is moving towards free trade in this area too, without making any obstacle to the multilateral round. So I'd just like to put that.
I'll ask Jagdish to...
No, I think there's a confusion on this point. Certainly, to say that multilateral system is moving slower, therefore you're moving faster on bilaterals, simply for Chile is untrue. You waited God knows how many years to get your FTA with the United States. In the meantime, we had the Uruguay round concluded, Doha round is making progress. So this is just rhetoric. You don't know Chilean history probably as much as you should. Secondly, we are not talking about what is in the interest of Chile. It's conceivable to Chile's advantage. We're looking at the systemic impact and simply saying that as a result of each one pursuing what they think is right, they're taking decisions which for the system as a whole is cluttering it up with all kinds of preferences and undermining the central principle of the system. So nobody's blaming Chile or Australia or anything. I mean, that's for the Chileans and the Australians to decide. But the effect of that is really what we are talking about. And in fact, the conclusion we draw is very straightforward. There's no way we can stop you from believing that this is good for Chile. No way we can tell the politicians not to do it. But what it does show is that the need for a multilateral reaffirmation of MFN system and to reduce the MFN down to zero so that the effect of the preferences also goes to zero. That is the way to approach it. So we make a case of reinforcing the need to go along with the Doha round. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Aidan White from the International Federation of Journalists. I just wanted to say a couple of things to Peter Sutherland. I'm particularly interested in your rather strident comments regarding the attitudes of NGOs to the WTO. It seems to me that there are some NGOs that we all know perhaps are not as engaged as they should be, but there are a number of NGOs representing civil society that are deeply concerned that the WTO is really out of touch with people who suffer real impact from WTO activities and policies. And there is a meeting taking place at this time in Latin America, European Social Forum, which is actually would be discussing that. And the way that you have described it, I'm very concerned about, because one of the problems about the WTO surely is its detachment. The fact that it doesn't command a great deal of respect within communities may be very often for the points that Neil Kearney has pointed out. And shouldn't, after 10 years, the WTO be looking for forms of structural reform that will lead to more engagement of other groups? You described the bringing in of extraneous issues. I don't know whether that's a reference to social issues, cultural issues, in terms of the debate. But it seems to me that unless these sorts of issues are brought in and a mechanism is instituted which will command broader public support and engagement, then it's going to be very difficult for the WTO to get its own members, who at the moment are not delivering on the promises they made, to actually have pressure from inside. So I must say, I'd like to know what 2 or 3 major reforms are necessary to make the WTO more relevant to the community at large.
Well, very briefly, let me answer that. First of all, it was not a blanket condemnation of NGOs. It was a condemnation, which I repeat, of the NGOs who wanted to destroy the WTO and to argue that it shouldn't exist. There are many NGOs, and indeed I'm a member of some of them myself, who can be critical of aspects of the WTO, but are in favor of it in principle. And there are a number of us involved in a process at the moment looking at issues like that. So there are very good NGOs, and there are NGOs which have been destructive, and I'm against the destructive NGOs. With regard to dialogue with NGOs, I'm not going to go into it, but the report, if you read it, that was mentioned, the Consultative Board report, makes a constructive argument for how that involvement might take place. It's difficult to do it at the moment with the institution. It's the attack on the institution that annoys me, not the countries that are part of it, but the institution itself being involved in detailed dialogue with NGOs, some of which would wish to destroy it, seems to me to be excessive. And I believe that there should be support, and we've indeed identified means for debate with NGOs who are involved in constructive dialogue, albeit sometimes perhaps critical dialogue.
Microphone here, please.
Thank you, Alan Bryden. I'm the Secretary General of ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. I would like to bring a testimony and a question to the panel. Testimony is about one of the successes of WTO, the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, to which we are closely associated. It has created a mechanism for prevention by notification and also dispute settlement. It has been also a very great driver to attract participation in the development of international standards, both in developed and developing countries. And in ISO, we have a special program to facilitate participation of developing countries in our work, and we collaborate with WTO. That's for the testimony. Now for the question on another subject, the area of services. We see an increase of the development of national standards relating to the quality of services, outsourcing, deregulation of public services, and an increase of international trade in this area. So how do you see WTO's future in the area of services?
Well, you know, we've just begun with our negotiation in the area of services, and this is one area in which I find quite disappointing because I don't think we have moved far enough as yet. At the moment, there are about 70 countries being involved in the negotiation out of the 148, and so we are now trying to do our best to get countries involved. We are providing assistance to the developing countries so that they can put up the right package of their services, offers, and things like that. But touching upon the point of your question about the regulation on public services and standards which be attached to those services, I don't think we will be reaching out to that level because in the services negotiation, you know that we do it along the line of what is called bottom-up. So what the country is willing to voluntarily participate in the issues concerned, what kind of sectors they would like to offer for opening up, or what kind of foreign presence they would like to have in which sectors, what kind of domestic rules and regulation they would like to adopt. So I don't think we are that far yet. I think if we can succeed in getting the majority of our membership to make the right kind of offers for this round and to have a good exchange of offers and requests, I think we'll be there. And if we can work on the key modes that would be of interest for the developing countries, because the developing countries seem to have less interest compared to advanced countries. So we're trying to work on areas in which there will be more interest coming from developing countries, like in Mode 4, with the movement of natural person, and Mode 1, which is delivery of services cross-border and things like that. But all of modes will be involved. But to touch upon the standards, I think that would be something that is not yet within the scope of this round.
Okay, please, I hope, let's hear, and probably you and Neil can react to that.
Thank you. I'm Ignacio Walker. I'm not an economist like my friend Felipe Larraín, but I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Chile. And I was a little bit puzzled about these remarks about proliferation of free trade agreements being somehow contradictory or counterproductive in terms of the objectives of the WTO. Because it's not the interest of Chile, Professor Bhagwati, what we are taking care of. Beyond that is the interest of our partners moving towards free trade. All these free trade agreements taken together that we have signed up in the last 10 years account for 1.3 billion people around the world. So it's creating a space for free trade agreement beyond the interests of Chile and even of Latin America. In fact, our story began unilaterally by bringing down tariff barriers from 15% in 1990 to 6% today, but because of FTAs, it's 2 or 3%. So I think that unilateral, bilateral, regional openings towards free trade is not necessarily contradictory with advocating free trade at the multilateral level. In fact, in the APEC meeting in November in Santiago, Chile, 21 economists, we reinforced our commitment to push and to influence further free trade liberalization at the multilateral level. So I was a little bit puzzled and confused about these initiatives at the unilateral or bilateral or regional levels being contradictory with that aim that we share in common of pushing towards multilateral trade agreement.
Well, we take notice of your comment, Minister. I would like to first ask President Deiss and then Neil to make some comments so that we can wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was on services. I would like to add something, and I'm thankful to the question which has been given. If we all agree that Doha round has to be in favor of developing countries, Doha round therefore has to be on agriculture, like Luiz Furlan has said. But it should not stop there. I think that even in the interest of developing countries, it's important that we have also results in NAMA, that means non-agricultural products, and in services, and in other fields of horizontal level. Often this question is turned down in saying, well, NAMA services, it's the interest of the industrialized countries. I don't think that this is so. Because to go only for agriculture in order to solve the problem of developing countries will not be enough. If their welfare will increase, they will have an enormous population which will leave agriculture. And you have to know where they will be active. And so even in developing countries, we need to develop industry and services. And therefore, I plead that Doha round will be on all these topics, and not only agriculture, if I can agree that the agriculture will be the key to enter the whole Doha round.
Thank you. Neil?
I think Peter Sutherland perhaps has the view that because I come from the textile sector, that I keep my head in the sand. I should say that the vast majority of the members of my global trade union organization are working in developing countries, indeed in some of the poorest countries in the world. He made reference to the fact that the multi-fiber arrangement had been condemned, widely condemned. Yes, widely condemned by trade specialists. But it's interesting to look at the impact of trade regulation in textiles and clothing. It resulted in the development of the industry in countries which would not have had any other manufacturing industry. Bangladesh, Lesotho, Dominican Republic, you name them, countries in every continent, maybe 30, 40 countries that would not have had industrial development. But today, their only source of industrial employment is the textile and clothing sector. Now, I welcome the impact that trade has had on those economies and the benefits that it has brought. But those benefits could have been substantially greater had there been a social dimension to that trade. Had the garment workers, the young women in Bangladesh, been able to do more than simply subsist on the salaries that they have earned, had they had salaries that would have enabled them to buy not only products from their own country, but also products that were imported. I believe, you see, trade must have a purpose. It cannot be an end in itself. And I know that the WTO talks a lot about fairness in rules and everything else. But fair rules don't always produce fair results. And one size doesn't fit all. It's interesting that our colleagues from Chile raised the question of bilateral agreements. And I think bilateral the upsurge in the number of bilateral agreements points to the fact that the WTO itself has been failing in this respect. It has gone for a one-size-fits-all rather than trying to take into account specific needs of specific economies. In general, from a worker's point of view, trade should raise living standards, it should reduce poverty, and it should lead to sustainable development. If it doesn't, why should we promote it? Now, the WTO has many challenges in the period ahead, and if you want to celebrate the 11th birthday or the 15th birthday, I believe there are a number of things that need to be done. First of all, the WTO will need to be more fair in its structures and in its decision-making. It will need to be more transparent. It will need to engage in coherence approaches with the other international institutions, including the International Labour Organization. And it will need to improve its dialogue and involvement with civil society.
Thank you, Neil. Well, I think all of us believe that, as it was reflected in the town hall meeting yesterday, that priority number one should be fighting poverty in the world. But I would insist on the idea that trade is only one among many instruments. And sometimes people tend to believe that WTO should do what other institutions at the international level and also institutions in every country can do and should do to overcome the challenge of development. I think it will be very healthy for this debate if we had time to go back to the basics and discuss what are the limits of trade to contribute towards the development goal, and what are the limits of an organization that is perfectly democratic in the sense that is member-driven and in which every member has veto power. I just wish that the Doha round is concluded and addresses some of the issues that you have raised, Neil, but also some of the failures that have been pointed out by other members of the panel. I do believe that the world needs freer trade, the world needs multilateral institutions, and particularly in this field, because otherwise we will have the law of the jungle. And I finish by mentioning that I was very happy yesterday when I listened to President Chirac endorsing the Sachs report, of which I was part. And I was even happier to notice that his advisors didn't read the trade chapter of the Sachs report, because among other things, we are recommending there that the Doha round should commit countries, speaking about agriculture to reduce tariffs to 5% for OECD countries, 10% by the developing countries, 15% poorest countries by 2015. The round should produce fully decouple of all support payments to farmers by 2015 and should cap that support to only 5% of value of agricultural production. Now it's 50%. And of course, the round should abolish all export subsidies by 2010 and remove all non-tariff barriers by 2010, and of course support efficiently and massively poor countries to adjust to the new regime. So I am very happy that President Chirac was not informed of that chapter of the Sachs report. Thank you very much.